Download the BBC Sounds app to listen now.
Jump! So say we all. So say we all. So say we all. So say we all. Apollo!
It's about time.
Battlestar Galactica. All episodes streaming now on BBC iPlayer.
Am I red?
Politics England with all the latest news and debate in an hour on BBC One after Andrew Marr.
Good morning. It looks like it's going to be a pretty ropey autumn and a very rough winter. Infections up sharply, ministers responding with fines of up to £10,000 and perhaps soon a new lockdown. Right now we're living under the rule of 6. That may well be needed to save the lives of people we love and the lives of strangers. But this is tight and cold and narrow. Humans need crowds, the wisdom of crowds and the foolishness of crowds, and gatherings and hubbub and parties and jostling and hugs. Maybe this is just the time we somehow have to get through. And it may seem a strange thought for an interview show, but perhaps to do that we need a bit less anger in our politics and a little bit more generosity. Now, in better times, I'd be off to the seaside or some great city for the Labour conference. Can't do that. But we can speak in the first of our Leader Conference season interviews to Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. And as the government struggles with the failures of the testing system and discusses these new restrictions, I'll be asking the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, if, this time, ministers aren't perhaps overreacting. Also, as the eyes of the world flicker constantly over to the US presidential election race, I'll be talking to the great Watergate journalist Bob Woodward about his encounters with President Trump and how the world came closer to nuclear war recently than anyone realised. So, relentlessly cheerful and upbeat as ever this morning. To go through the day's news, I'm joined by the BBC's Joe Coburn, host of Politics Live, and as many people across the English North and Midlands are already living with extra restrictions, by the political editor of the Manchester Evening News, Jennifer Williams. Before that, the news proper with Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. People in England who fail to self-isolate if they test positive for coronavirus or when told to by the Test and Trace service could be fined up to £10,000. Ministers have agreed to impose the new laws, which also include financial support for those who can't work from home, to try to slow a rising number of coronavirus infections. Rich Preston has this report.
The government's own scientific advisors have suggested that as few as 1 in 5 people may be fully following the current self-isolation guidelines. So, Downing Street is taking action. It's placing a legal obligation on those who test positive or who are contacted by NHS Test and Trace to self-isolate. Anyone who doesn't can be fined £1,000, increasing up to £10,000 for repeat offenders and for what the government calls the most egregious breaches. The new measures come into effect on September the 28th. There are to be discussions with the devolved administrations with the aim of making these rules UK-wide. And there's acknowledgement too that self-isolating is easier for some than for others. The government says money will be available for people on low incomes and who can't work from home. A lump sum of £500 to incentivise self-isolation. The government says some 4 million people in England will be eligible. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said the UK is now seeing its second wave and is taking the weekend to consider if and when new nationwide restrictions across England may need to be introduced. Rich Preston, BBC News.
President Trump has promised to nominate a woman to replace the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg as early as next week. Her death on Friday prompted an outpouring of public grief, but also sparked a public row over her replacement. Mr. Trump's Democrat rival, Joe Biden, insists her post shouldn't be filled until after the upcoming election. A package containing the deadly poison ricin, which was addressed to President Donald Trump, has been intercepted. Officials say that the letter was discovered at a screening facility before it reached the White House. The FBI and Secret Service are now investigating the source and whether others have been sent through the US postal system. A memorial service is to be held at Westminster Abbey this morning, marking 80 years since the Battle of Britain. The battle, fought entirely in the air, was a major turning point in the Second World War. The Abbey has held a Thanksgiving service on Battle of Britain Sunday every year since 1944. Today's service is the first at the Abbey since lockdown, but attendance will be significantly reduced. That's it from me. The next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Now back to you, Andrew.
Very many thanks for that. And now, as ever, to the front pages. Very often, every paper has got a different story. Today, they are all leading with exactly the same story. Sunday Times, £10,000 fine for people failing to self-isolate. Sunday Telegraph, fines of up to £10,000 for failing to self-isolate. £10,000 fine if you refuse to self-isolate. Are you getting the message, folks? Observer, £10,000 fines for failing to self-isolate as infections soar. That is the only story in town, Joe, is it not?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it's clear because it's a big number, £10,000.
It's a really big number.
It is. It starts at £1,000 if you fail to self-isolate. If you've been told to do so by test and trace, rises to £10,000.
So,
it reveals an anxiety at the heart of government, which is, what do we do about rising cases, about rising number of infections, particularly in areas and parts of the country where there are already restrictions?
Okay, so I have a prior question, Joe. How do we know when someone is supposed to self-isolate and are sneaking down to the corner shop instead? Who's going to find this out?
Well, I'm not going to ask what you would do if your neighbour had more than 6 people, the rule of 6 having been introduced, but we certainly have been asking politicians all week. And as you know, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, doesn't like the idea of what somebody might call a snitch sort of society where you look in your neighbour's garden and you see they've got 8 people. But there were politicians, Priti Patel, Kit Malthouse, these are ministers who say, yes, I would actually call the police and tell them that my neighbours are breaking the law.
So to make this work, we need to go to a Dobbin society or a surveillance society of some kind, and that angers and worries an awful lot of Tory MPs.
It does. I mean, you've got this, I think if you look across the papers today, and in fact over the last few days, you've got this big question, existential question almost, about what does the government do now? Is the rise in the number of infections so big that it will translate into high numbers of deaths, or, as many Conservative MPs feel, a rise in infections that hasn't translated into deaths or higher hospitalisations, a little bit of an uptick, doesn't need
we should
more
be
restrictions.
destroying the economy in order to do that. Now, we've talked about the £10,000 fine lot. There's another side to this story, Jen, which is the £500 to be handed to people to help them self-isolate. That's been a big issue up in Manchester.
Yeah, it has, and politicians and public health officials here have been calling on the government to provide this kind of money for months, really. I mean, Andy Burnham has sort of framed it as a kind of jury service payment, where it's a civic duty, but for a lot of people, they can't necessarily afford to actually do it. So they believe in some parts of Greater Manchester, this has been part of the reason that people have been perhaps difficult to track down through the track and trace system, because they've been reluctant to actually do that. There's a lot of people in high risk, low paid frontline jobs in Greater Manchester, and which is mirrored in our infection rates as well. So I think that this is an attempt to try and, it's part of that carrot and stick approach, isn't it? And understandably, it is kind of drowned out by the £10,000 fine. But I think for a lot of people in public health, it will be a really, really welcome announcement.
And so presumably a lot of these people involved are working effectively freelance. If they don't go to work, they don't get the money to pay for food to feed their families, and therefore it's a really, really hard ask to insist that they stay inside their homes.
Yeah, exactly, and people on 0 hours contracts. And one of the concerns about the way that the virus has continued to spread in Greater Manchester over the summer has been people working in the kind of jobs where they can't afford not to go into work, even if they feel as though they'll be at risk doing so. And that was something that came up in the first phase of the pandemic as well. So there's been a real push, and actually, in fairness, Dido Harding, the head of the track and trace system, I think has been pushing internally for the government to take up this proposal. I don't know why it has taken them so so long, but you get the sense that now there is a kind of rising sense of panic in the government, isn't there? So,
and as you go around your home beat reporting and looking at what people are doing, do you think that people are by and large obeying the rule of 6, or is there an enforcement problem there, do you think?
Well, I mean, the rule of 6 in some respects is by the by, because Greater Manchester's been under extra restrictions since July the 30th, and since then that has been tinkered with so many times by the government that we now have 4 sets of rules across 10 boroughs. So, I mean, I cover this every day, but I would struggle to tell you exactly how they vary from borough to borough as you cross boundaries in Greater Manchester, and I think that this would be something which the government is going to struggle to do when these kinds of numbers reach London. I think as a result, compliance has been difficult even among people who want to follow the rules, quite frankly, because it's difficult to work out what exactly it is you're supposed to be doing.
And hence, I suppose, the idea of simplifying them. Jennifer Williams, thanks for the moment very much indeed. Joe, let's talk about the politics of this.
Yes.
It's a very interesting intervention by Sir Graham Brady, who's chairman of the 1922 committee and therefore an influential figure in Conservative circles. And he makes a fairly straightforward point.
He does, and this is really referencing this discussion that we were having at the beginning about whether this is an overreaction. This whole talk about bringing in restrictions, it does seem inevitable, but if you have a look at this in the Mail on Sunday, it says 1922 Chief Brady leads revolt on COVID powers. Sir Graham Brady is the head of the 1922 Committee of Backbench Conservative MPs. These are powers that the government has. They were brought in at the beginning of the pandemic here in the UK to literally bring in restrictions when they felt it was necessary. Now, they want there to be some sort of check, scrutiny, a lock before Boris Johnson brings in what could be national restrictions, what they're calling a circuit break, but might be more likely to try and restrict more socialising. The sort of thing we've heard Jen talk about in Greater Manchester could be brought in other areas, including London, in order to try and slow down the transmission spread, which comes back to this question that you raised, which is whether or not these restrictions are necessary right now, as many people believe they are, or, as Graham Brady and some Tory MPs think, no, we would like to scrutinise it. And just one final point on that, you will remember that when they brought in this rule of 6, they were told off, the government, for not having brought it to Parliament first of all, and even the Speaker was very angry that they didn't have a chance to look at this.
So we should say that, of course, right at the beginning of the coronavirus epidemic, Parliament gave the government, frankly, again, the power to make all sorts of regulations. And now, many months on, lots of MPs have thought, actually, do you know what? This is a parliamentary democracy. We ought to be debating it as well. Labour MPs, of course, feel the same thing, many of them, but we ought to be debating this in the House of Commons. There's a very interesting article by Janet Daly, a Conservative commentator, saying we're trying to do Brexit to reassert parliamentary sovereignty. We are a parliamentary democracy. So why is Parliament not debating these really, really important and quite serious, heavy new powers?
Right, and that, of course, the government will say is because we need to do these things with speed and when it's necessary. Others will say, I mean, when you look at this piece here in the Sunday Telegraph, and this was a headline written, I think, with Boris Johnson in mind.
Scylla and Charybdis.
Scylla and Charybdis, the classical references there between a rock and a hard place for Boris Johnson, as to whether he should be able to bring in quite draconian, as some people would see it, restrictions, if they will work in terms of bringing down those numbers of infections. So as you look at this piece here, the decisions he makes, which I suppose the indication is that they're going to clamp down on people's socialising in order to allow people to still go to school and go to workplaces.
Jen, we're talking obviously about the government restrictions, but the Labour Party's view of this is also very important going forward. I'll be talking to Sir Keir Starmer later on, but he has appeared in quite a few of the papers giving some really, really interesting interviews. Sunday Mirror.
Yeah, he has. I mean, the standout line in the interview that he gave with the Sunday Times seems to be comparing Labour MPs to donkeys. And
I think let's explain this, Jen. It's otherwise a little unfair.
He's talking about, so we've seen stories previously about the fact that his family had basically a donkey sanctuary, a small donkey sanctuary when he was growing up. So he's gone out and done a whole load of the Labour Party's under new management kind of interviews this weekend, and one of the lines that has come out is him joking about how, well, I'm used to trying to get donkeys to do something, but it's good practice for dealing with Labour MPs. So that's where that line came from, and it's obviously quite an eye-catching one. I actually think the thing that struck me about that interview is that aside from that line, you don't really find out that much about Sir Keir Starmer, and I get the sense that there's still very tight control within the kind of Labour machine around kind of gradually inching forwards and not making any errors and allowing the kind of government to essentially hang themselves during this period. And they've clearly, there were many occasions when things that Jeremy Corbyn had said or things about him had been leaked that were on the front of the Sunday papers last year, and I don't think they want to find themselves in that position again.
Do you think, therefore, that Keir Starmer, who has been very, very cautious and seen his polling get better and better and better, and Labour are now level pegging for the first time since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister with the Tories, do you think he'll be quite pleased that he's not splashed all over the front pages in Labour Conference Week?
I think probably at the moment Labour will probably be happy enough that the Conservatives are continually splashing on the front pages as a result of all kinds of different chaos, whether it's U-turns, whether it's the Brexit drama, whether it's the problems within the track and trace system. I can't imagine that Labour will have too many problems with that.
All right, thanks very much, Jen. Very quickly, Joe, quick thought on Keir Starmer this morning.
Well, I mean, I, like Jen, rather like the headline. Of course, it is rather eye-catching, as you said, but she's absolutely right. This is sort of slowly moving forward. There isn't that much personal stuff. He doesn't need to do it at the moment. He just needs to tread carefully. He'll be very pleased with the polls, but also in those polls, there's a mountain still to climb for Labour in terms of how it's regarded on the economy and in terms of the party more broadly. But he himself, he'll be very pleased with how he's doing, and of course he's got his big speech on Tuesday.
Joe, thanks very much. Jen, thank you very much indeed. Now, Joe will be back to cover the virtual Labour Party conference on Politics Live this week. On Tuesday there'll be full coverage of Keir Starmer's leader's speech at the beginning at 11 o'clock on BBC Two. And if you're looking for something to cheer you up, then the weather has been again this week truly spectacular for most of us. Gorgeous, gin-clear mornings, light, refreshing winds and blasts of genuinely hot sunshine. I wish the rest of the news was like that, but meanwhile, over to Helen Willits in the weather studio. Helen.
Andrew, all change as well weather-wise this week, and of course at this time of year that sort of weather in the morning goes hand in hand with some fog problems, which is what we've seen today. It's a fog and low cloud that's coming off the North Sea here, and it's sitting over the northern and western Isles as well. It'll be slow to clear here with some drizzle, but the cloud that we've seen creeping inland should edge back to the coast, but obviously a bit of a different day for some parts of eastern Scotland and northeast England. Still the chance of a few sharp showers running into eastern coastal counties, the Channel Islands, but again, like you've just mentioned, it's going to be very warm for the time of year, away from those rather chilly east coasts if you're stuck under the cloud, that is. That cloud perhaps returning tonight, but as we lose that crisp breeze that we've had in the south through tonight, we are more at risk here as well for some fog tomorrow morning. Quite a chilly start, as you can see under the starry skies, and potentially some fog for the morning commute. Of course,
have them, but can't get them. Yes, demand is up, but that's hardly surprising after we were told to get back to work and to eat out to help out. Something has gone wrong, but what? As the country braces itself for yet more restrictions, I'm joined by the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. Matt Hancock, welcome. Before we get into all of that, let's look at where we actually are as a country. Now, the government produced a series of tests as to where we were, and we can see some of them here. There is COVID alert level 3 and COVID alert level 4. Can I ask you, where are we now?
Well, this country faces a tipping point, and we have a choice. And the choice is, if everybody follows the rules and does the self-isolation, if they need to, follows the rule of 6, which is really simple and clear, and the basics, hands, face and space, then we can avoid further measures.
Yeah.
But the alternative to that choice is that we will have to bring in more action. And we don't want to do that, but every single person has a part to play in this, and everybody watching has a choice. Do you follow the rules or not? And if everybody follows the rules, then we'll be able to get the virus under control.
And they will hear you, I'm sure. But which level are we at the moment? 3 or 4?
Well, we're currently at level 3, but obviously the clinicians look at this all of the time.
So I'm just asking, because this is your own government's advice, and it says at level 3, you're actually talking about a gradual relaxing of restrictions and social distancing measures. And even if we go to level 4, it's still the current measures, and yet you're bringing in new restrictions. Why?
Well, we're bringing in new restrictions because the number of cases is shooting up. And the measures that we're bringing in today are about supporting people to do the right thing, £500 for people on low incomes to self-isolate, but also requiring, with a much more stringent measures, that people must self-isolate if they have had a positive test, or if they've been a contact who's been contacted by NHS Test and Trace. And we've discussed many times that if people follow the rules,
sure,
then that helps us all.
I get that, but looking at this £10,000 fine, it's a really big fine, and the question is, that must depend, presumably, on surveillance. People dobbing in their neighbours or their co-workers or whatever, people reporting others in, and yet the Prime Minister was very, very clear this week, he didn't believe in that. He said he didn't want to be part of what he called a sneak culture. So in terms of confusing messaging from the government, I put it to you, again, we have a confused message. On the one hand, dob in your neighbour so they can be properly fined for not self-isolating. On the other hand, don't sneak. Which is it?
Well, we're extremely clear that that people must follow the rules, and if they don't, then we are bringing in this much more stringent enforcement. We have, on self-isolation, we've relied on people's civic duty to do the right thing, but there is a minority of people.
So how do you find out about minority of people?
Well, there'll be more stringent enforcement.
But how do you find out about it?
Well, a combination of public health professionals, the council, and the police. Of course, when we have contacted you through NHS Test and Trace and said that you must self-isolate, either because you've tested positive or because you have been a close contact of somebody who's tested positive, then we know who those people are, and we are able to ensure that they follow the rules. Would you
call the police on the neighbour?
Yes, and for the self-isolation part, that if they go to a party where they think there might not be social distancing and more than 6 people, if people break the rules, then we are more likely to end up with national measures. And I don't want to see those national measures, but it is absolutely critical at this moment that everybody stops, takes a step back, and realises we've all got a part to play.
Now, you've been very, as it were, serious and solemn about the moment the country is facing it. And I want to just test that a little bit, because although infections are clearly rising, death rates are not yet. For instance, according to the ONS, in the first week of September, deaths in England and Wales due to COVID-19 were at their lowest level for 25 weeks, and in England, COVID-19 was only the 24th most common cause.
Every days or so.
This is people going into
hospital. And then, with a lag, you see the number of people dying sadly rising. So if you look at the 2 countries that it's worth comparing us to, one gives the warning, the other gives the hope. Spain has seen the number of cases absolutely shoot up. It then saw the number of hospitalisations, and for a while people said, oh, don't worry, there isn't an increase in the number of people dying, just as you've said. It has now seen the number of deaths really start to rise. The same is starting to happen in France. Belgium, on the other hand, the country came together, they introduced a rule of 5, we have a rule of 6.
Very, very, very unpopular in Belgium.
Well, I don't mind. I'm not in this for a popularity contest. I'm in this to keep the country safe. And
Matt Hancock, sorry.
And the point is...
The fourth country, obviously, being Sweden, which did not introduce a tough lockdown, had much less restrictive measures, and which seems to have beaten the virus in a way that we haven't.
Well, sadly, I wish that were true as well, but it's not. Sweden brought in laws to tighten social contact, and countries tend to follow a pattern according to their geography.
Well, they're certainly less stringent than us.
The other thing that happened in Sweden is that they brought in guidance which everybody follows, whereas here, when we brought in guidance as opposed to the law, we've seen a fraying of the following of that.
Groups this week. He said it's profoundly disappointing that 6 months into this pandemic, having rejected every alternative proposed, we keep coming back to lockdown, a strategy that is visibly failing around the world.
Well, unfortunately, that analysis it doesn't learn the lessons of recent history. We've seen, firstly, we do know that lockdowns work. They are our last line of defence, and we do not want to do it. But of course they work, because we saw it work in the spring. Secondly, we have taken local action, and that has brought cases right under control in places like Luton and Herefordshire and Norfolk.
Well, let me ask you about Oldham, where you've had a very tough series of local restrictions now for 4 weeks, and where the rate of infection in that time has doubled.
Well, clearly the enforcement needed needs to go further and needs to be stronger. But the idea that we should just let this all go and we should just, don't worry, we can, it'll be fine this time round. We know from history that is
don't work, is what they really both say.
One saying it doesn't work, one saying it hasn't worked because it hasn't been tough enough. If what I have to do is listen to the scientific advice, which is brought together by the chief medical officer, the chief scientific advisor, all these different disparate scientific voices, and then I have to make a judgment along with the rest of the government.
And you've got your dashboards and all the lights are going red and you can see infections are rising and rates of hospital admission are rising as well, and the question is what's next? Now, we've had this strange bit of jargon about a circuit breaker. What actually is a circuit breaker?
Well, look, we're looking at all different options.
But you put this term out, circuit breaker. We're facing a circuit breaker. What is it, is what I'm asking?
Well, that was another proposal that came from the scientists.
Is it going to happen?
Well, what I'm telling you.
So what is it?
It's really simple. The answer to this, and I come back to what I said right at the start of this discussion, which is that we face a choice, right? If everybody everybody follows the rules, and we'll be increasingly stringent on the people who are not following the rules. If every over have a capacity of just over 250,000.
Not capacity, but people.
Over 200,000.
More than 200,000 actual people are being tested at the moment every day.
Yesterday it was 226,000, yes.
So that is about 20% of those asking for tests every day.
Well, thankfully the demand has come down a bit this week since the figures that Dido talked about, and the reason for that is that we saw this spike in people who don't have symptoms and aren't eligible coming forward for a test, and we've been clearer and more stringent about prioritising the test for people who need them
Again,
who have symptoms.
I'm sorry to jump in, but for a long time we were told that it was your civic duty to get tested if there was any
If you have symptoms.
Yes, but presumably also if you've been in a place where you were worried that you might have picked it up.
No, if you have symptoms.
So if you don't have symptoms, under no circumstances, if in doubt, you used to say, if in doubt, get tested. People are in doubt and they're asking for tests.
No.
And they're being told they can't have them.
No. If you have symptoms, we've always been totally clear. It's really straightforward. If you have symptoms, please come forward and get a test. If you don't have symptoms, unless you've been specifically asked to by a public health professional, don't come forward and get a test.
You did actually say, if in doubt, get a test.
If you're in doubt of your symptoms, absolutely. But crucially this, right? During the summer, we had plenty of spare capacity in the testing system, and there wasn't the demand. Capacities continued to go up, and demand has shot up. We have to prioritise, and we have to make sure that the tests are there for the people who really need them most, and that means people in hospital, people in care homes. I send 100,000 tests a day, just over, into care homes.
And it's back into care homes, isn't it?
That's a big chunk of the capacity, and it'd be politically easier to give them to people who are sort of making a lot of noise. But I want to make sure these tests go to the people who need them most.
Sticking with tests, they're only really useful if you get quite a quick turnaround.
Yes.
Back in June, Boris Johnson promised that everybody would have, he promised that by the end of June, everybody would be having a turnaround within 24 hours.
Yeah.
The figure 3 months on is something like 14%. It's a real problem. You're not turning around these tests nearly fast enough.
Well, it's not quite as low as that, but
what is the percentage?
In the next day, it's about half. It clearly needs to go up, and we're putting in extra resources to get that turnaround time up as well. What happened is that when the spike in demand came, so that also has led to pressure on the system. And the turnaround time, the vast majority still come back within 48 hours.
14%.
But if you pick one part of the testing system,
very important. People out there, it's 14%, and it should be 100. There's a massive gap.
I'm sorry. The reason that I picked you up on your figures there is because you can't just pick one bit of the system. Okay, you've got to look at the system as a whole, and it's perfectly easy for a research prioritisation. And we also need to keep building that capacity. And I will just strain every sinew to get the capacity.
Very quick and simple question. Not a simple question, a very quick question. Everybody is wondering when a usable vaccine, will arrive. What's your best information?
Well, there is still hope that we will get one of the vaccines over the line this year, and the Oxford vaccine is still at the front of the queue. You will have heard a couple of weeks ago that we had to pause it briefly for safety reasons. That shows we'll always take put safety first. More likely is next year. And probably the early part of next year. What this shows is that we've got to take the social distancing incredibly seriously. because we've got the cavalry coming over the next few months, the vaccine, the mass testing, and the improvement in treatments. But we've got to all follow the rules between now and then to keep people safe.
That has been your message. If we don't do that, what do you think the death rate will hit?
Well, I don't know, and I don't want it to. I don't want it to go up, and it's unknowable because it depends on the behaviour of every single person in this country.
All right, Matt Hancock, thanks very much for talking to us. Now then, Bob Woodward was one half of the team that broke the Watergate story which brought down President Nixon. Along with Carl Bernstein, it's a partnership as famous in political journalism as Simon and Garfunkel were in pop music. In recent years, he's been producing a series of political books, of which the latest, Rage, tells the inside story of the Trump administration, not least through a series of interviews with the president himself. Among the revelations, not least, was that President Trump deliberately downplayed the danger from COVID-19, which has so far killed more than 200,000 Americans. Here is a recording of the president explaining to Bob why.
Well, I think, Bob, really, to be honest with you,
Sure, I want you to
I
be.
wanted to always play it down. I still like playing it down.
Yes, sir.
Because I don't want to create a panic.
On January
Many American lives.
I see this is false. When he told me on February 7th, the virus, as I say, was not on anyone's mind. I thought I misunderstood. I thought he was talking about China because President Trump told me the night before he'd been talking to Chinese President Xi. I did not learn about the key January 8th meeting until May. And then the virus was on fire. What would I say? Oh, it's airborne. Oh, people who don't have symptoms can transmit it. That was already known.
Well, let's turn to some of the other extraordinary revelations in this book. You say that some of the people closest to President Trump genuinely feared a full-on nuclear war with North Korea.
Well, the president told me that we came much closer to war with North Korea than anyone knows. The president says North Korean leader Kim Jong-un told him that. I report that Secretary of State Pompeo, who's as close to Trump as anyone, who's the number one senior cabinet officer, didn't know whether it was real or was a bluff. But Mattis, as the Secretary of Defense, had one responsibility, and that is to protect the country. And President Trump confirmed to me he authorized Secretary of Defense Mattis to shoot down a missile from North Korea if it was coming to the United States. At that moment, because North Korea had a couple of dozen nuclear weapons well concealed, Mattis's worry, which is one anyone would have in that position, that if he shot down a North Korean missile, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un would say, well, now I've got to use all the weapons I have, and we would have had a nuclear war.
Now, you've come to know the president pretty well, Bob, over the last few years. If in November he loses and Joe Biden wins, do you think he will accept the result?
Who knows? I asked him about this, and he said it's one of the things. He said, I'm not going to comment on that now publicly. He's made it clear he has no confidence in the procedures of counting and making decisions on this. Put on your seatbelt, because we're going to go through multiple hurricanes, electoral hurricanes, and hailstorms, and what comes of this. I think now it's his responsibility to come forward with the other party, with the Democrats, and come up for some procedures and say, let's have a level playing field and let's make sure this is fair. But Trump is not doing that, and he has sowed discord and distrust in the system across the board.
Bob Woodward, seatbelt on. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Now a look at what's coming up on BBC One at 10:30.
Coming up on Sunday Morning Live.
As tougher sentencing laws are proposed, we'll discuss whether our prison system is fit for purpose.
Also, Lord Sugar tells us how we can save the high street from the impact of lockdown.
And why, stay with me here, autumn is actually the new spring. We'll reveal why sowing seeds now could be good for the environment and our souls. Join us at 10:30.
Well, we care about our souls. Now, normally this morning, the streets of one conference town, maybe Manchester, Birmingham or Brighton, would be seething with Labour Party members there to debate new policies, to drink, to socialise and to scrutinise what Keir Starmer declares is a new leadership. Coronavirus has killed that off this year, but now with Labour level pegging in the polls, I'm joined by Sir Keir for our traditional party leader interview. He's played it very cautiously so far, but with his brand spanking new slogan, New Leadership, is he prepared to take positions on the really big issues? Keir Starmer.
Morning.
Welcome. Can I ask you, new leadership, does that mean taking the Labour Party in a different direction?
It means recognising the scale of the defeat in December and the fact that we've lost 4 elections. It means listening particularly to those that used to vote Labour and don't anymore, changing and focusing on winning the next general election, because if you're in opposition, you're not changing anything. So, and taking difficult decisions on things like anti-Semitism. So
you talk about taking difficult decisions. Let me give you the difficult decision confronting the country right now. Is it time for a national lockdown?
Well, I don't think a lockdown is inevitable, but I think it's now more likely because of the near collapse of testing. And my concern is that the government is losing control of where the virus is, which is why we're talking of a national scheme.
Would you be prepared to introduce a national lockdown in these circumstances?
Whatever measure the government takes, we will support it. We did that with lockdown, we did that with local restrictions, and I've said that whatever measures are taken. But listen, if I was the Prime Minister, I would apologise for the fact that we're in this situation with testing. Throughout the summer, we were saying prepare for the autumn. Instead, we had the exams fiasco. I would make fixing testing the number one priority and reinstate the daily press conferences so we all know what's going on. Because up and down the country, people are really concerned about the fact that the testing system is near collapsed.
So you're in favour of tough decisions. What I'm asking you is what tough decisions you would take now, because you've given a very good assessment of where we are, an analysis of the government, but nonetheless politicians have to say, is this time for a lockdown? Would you ask pubs and restaurants to close now to save lives?
Andrew, I'm not giving you my view on that for this reason, and it's not to duck it. No, it's not to duck it. One of the very important things in a pandemic is there's clarity of communications. People know exactly. It's the reason I've said I'll support the government. So the government's got their scientific advisors. They will make their decision.
Okay.
Now, I may, sometimes we look at the decision.
So here's
no, but let me finish because it's really important. They make a decision, we will follow that and we will reinforce their communications, because in the end this is not about party politics, this is about getting this nation through this virus. So if the government takes action, I will support that and we will support it, and I will support their message, because what I want, like the government, is for this virus to come back under control. The single biggest problem is testing.
So here is something that has nothing to do with the science. Do you think that a £10,000 fine for failing to self-isolate is too draconian?
I think it is necessary to take measures against the very few people who are frequently and repeatedly breaking the rules. But But the vast
Would you encourage people to, as it were, dob in their neighbours?
The vast majority of people are following the rules, and I want to say thank you to them for that, because they've been doing it for months. Their biggest problem up until now has been clarity about what the rules are, and that's why it's good we've gone to a rule of 6. We need that clarity. But as for dobbing in your neighbour, I think most people, and the police have actually done this very well over the last few months, by consent, cajoling, advising, instructing people, we've managed to get the vast majority of people to comply with the rules. Where there are outliers, the few people that are obviously flouting the rules on a repeated basis, then I support the government in doing something about that.
So you support the government in virtually everything it's doing. That is why Boris Johnson, who has a turn of phrase, calls you Captain Hindsight. He says you're criticising things they used to do, but whatever they do now, you just agree with them.
Let me take that head on, because months ago I set out in terms that as we got to the autumn and winter, we would run into the flu. We do every year. And I said to the government, you need to plan for this, because otherwise you're going to get into this situation where people have flu symptoms, which are similar to COVID symptoms. You need to. That was foresight. Let me just finish this, because what we've now seen is children have gone back to school, a good thing. People have gone back to work, a good thing. Lots of children have got flu-like symptoms, and therefore they're in school for a few days, then they're back out of school, or year groups are out of school. And the government is now saying, oh, we didn't really anticipate that. Now, SAGE advised absolutely clearly that in the autumn into the winter, 500,000 people a day would exhibit COVID-like symptoms through ordinary colds and flu. So
I hear
how
all of
have
that.
we got to this stage where the government's scratching its head and saying, we didn't really expect that?
That's looking back.
No, it's not, Andrew. I set that out. I set that out in terms.
First time round, you said the government locked down too late.
Yes.
This time, we are facing an unknown situation in front of the country, and I'm asking whether you would support a lockdown now, and you can't say you would, even though scientific advisors say this is the time to take a decision. They have to take decisions. Surely you can tell me whether you would take that decision.
Swift, decisive action from the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister usually told us as opposition leaders what he's going to do. I want him to set out in terms what he wants to do. I do not want to second guess what he's doing. I want him to get this right.
Well, Professor Neil Ferguson, very eminent epidemiologist and former government advisor, says if we leave it another 2 or 4 weeks, we'll be back at levels we were seeing more like mid-March, and that is going to cause deaths. I put it to you again, this is the time for political leaders to take bold decisions.
Take swift action. Do it in the next few days. Don't leave it for 2 to 4 weeks.
Which swift action do you want them to take in the next few days?
I want swift action. If necessary, local restrictions. Look at a national lockdown. The government's got the figures, but I don't want to leave it 2 or 4 weeks. In fact,
so you think we could have a national lockdown within a few days, and you would support that if it happened?
I want
whatever it is.
I will agree with it, and you know, of course, whenever the government takes action, there are different views on it. But I honestly believe it's right that when the government took lockdown last time, we supported it. When they took local restrictions, wherever it was in the country, we supported, local councils supported, and I've reiterated the government message because I think that is the right thing to do in the national interest. It doesn't prevent us challenging the government where they've got it wrong, and one area challenge them very, very hard.
One area you say they've got it wrong is on furlough. You want furlough to be extended in all sorts of areas. How much more are you prepared to spend on furlough?
Well, the principle here is that
it's cost £34 billion so far.
I know that. And it's been a welcome scheme, and it's probably kept many businesses in business. But the idea of ending it all at the same time for all businesses, all sectors, irrespective of the position they find themselves in, is just it doesn't make sense. Which is why businesses or trade unions against it. So what I've said
very
is
straightforward questions. Which sectors do you want to carry on supporting? For how long, and how much does it all cost?
Well, what we're not arguing, and this is often put to me, is that furlough should simply continue for everyone indefinitely. What I'm saying is there are very obvious sectors that need some support.
So
retail, hospitality, tourism. We can identify them. I would actually...
So let's take retail. How much is it going to cost to support the retail sector going forward with furlough, and how much are you prepared to spend on it?
Well, the IPPR put a figure of about £1.4 billion per month, but there's a cost.
That's a lot.
There is a lot, but there's a cost to not doing it. And the cost is that if otherwise good businesses go under, and jobs are lost, we will have mass unemployment. And a lot of people have either not lived through mass employment or forgotten what it's like.
Yeah.
That is a huge cost, it's a monetary cost, it's a societal cost, and it leaves deep scars for years.
The problem with your policy is that it keeps going lots of businesses which might otherwise go under and keeps people stuck in those businesses. The OECD has talked about zombie jobs and zombie businesses. They say that supporting jobs and companies, as you suppose, means trapping resources in non-productive zombie firms of jobs. What do you do to let people move to other jobs and retrain and so that when the economy revives, lots of new businesses can pop up?
Well, let's test that. Take British tourism. Are we really saying British tourism is now going to die out and we cannot support it into next year, so the best thing to do is to let all those businesses go bust, let everybody lose their job, retrain them in something else, and forget about British tourism next year?
So how long do you do it for, though? How long do you do it for?
The principle that the best thing to do is to simply allow these businesses to go under, and we won't ever need them again. Same with aviation. Are we really saying, right, it's going to go under, a bit like coal mining, it's come to the end of a long life?
How much are you prepared to spend to save the aviation industry, and for how long?
Well, we will sit down with government, we'll go through the figures, but the idea that we will not even countenance support, that we will let these businesses and jobs go to the wall because we don't want to go through the difficult exercise of identifying which we support or putting the money in, I think is wrong-headed.
So this is all going to cost a great deal of money. We already have...
Andrew, there's a cost of not doing it.
There certainly is. But we are now, I think for the first time since 1960, our national debt is higher than our GDP. It's a really, really terrifying figure. And at some point, you know, we have to pay it off. My question is, how do you pay it off? How are you going to resolve this huge debt hanging over the country?
Well, we're going to have to first see what the debt is. I'm afraid... so far as the economic consequences of COVID are concerned, we're still in the foothills. There's been the health crisis, there's the economic crisis coming alongside. We need to know what the size of the debt will be. I accept that because of furlough, I accept that because of the support that we say should continue, that debt will go up. And obviously we'll have to look at what the state of the finances are at the next election in 2024. Right. But there is a cost of inaction here.
You mentioned furlough again just now. There is one radical way of dealing with the problem which would allow people to move to different firms and different companies, which is a universal basic income. Now, one of your frontbenchers, Sima Malhotra, supports that. Many people in the party support it. Are you radical enough to support a universal basic income?
I think we should look at all options. We're not committed to it. But, I mean, it's an interesting question because one of the challenges for the Labour Party and for all political parties is the scale of what we're going to have to approach, because COVID, in a sense, has pushed away all the arguments of the past. What we're arguing about in 2019, 2017, 2015 are as naught to what we've got to think about for 2024. Yes. Okay. But we're not proposing it, but obviously we'll look at all ideas.
Coming back to how we pay for this, you either pay for it by cutting public spending, or you pay for it by raising taxes. Which is it?
Well, I don't think we should raise taxes at the moment. I think
so. It's not that much. You're going to cut public spending
at the moment. To cut taxes when we need to boost the economy, I think won't work. When we know the size of the debt, when we get towards 2024, we will be setting out our proposals, looking at the size of the debt, what we want to spend our money on what a progressive tax regime will look like.
So this is odd. You're not saying you'd raise taxes, and you're not saying, I presume, that you'd slash public spending either, because you're the Labour Party. So I'm really confused about what you would do. You used to be in favour of a wealth tax. Well, are you in favour of a wealth tax?
Look, Andrew, what I'm saying is this: the next election is 2024.
Yeah. But you have to make some decisions before.
I appreciate that, but the idea of saying now, 4 years out, without knowing the debt, what the tax regime would pay, just doesn't make sense.
But it's a bit about values, isn't it? It's a bit about where you stand in terms of fairness in the entire country. The kind of people on whose shoulders you would expect the burden to rest. The last Labour leader said the top 5%. Would you support that?
Well, Andrew, what I'm saying is, as we get to the next election, we will see the scale of the debt we will be able to set out clearly what an incoming Labour government would spend its money on and what the regime is for making sure that those balance. But we will do it in an open way, but we will do it in a costed way.
Okay, no decisions for now. Let me turn in that case to Brexit, if we're not getting an answer on that.
Well, you are getting an answer, but you're not getting...
One day I will decide what I think, but not yet.
Well, the idea of writing the 2024 manifesto for the Labour Party 4 years out in the middle of a pandemic when we don't know the size of the debt doesn't seem to me to be very sensible.
Okay, well, let's talk about Brexit then, the other great crisis. Last time we talked, I said, would it be right to extend the deadline for these talks? And you said, in certain circumstances, if it's necessary to do so, the deadline should be extended. In the middle of this pandemic, with this huge debt hanging over the country, is it necessary to extend the deadline?
No. The Prime Minister said he'd got an oven-ready deal, he needs to get on and he needs to deliver it. And if he fails to do so, he needs to own that failure.
Okay, to resolve this problem with the EU, there are two things that can happen, so far as I can see. Either there is agreement on the two outstanding issues, which is fishing and state aid. Would you agree that the EU position is basically right on that, or would you like the government hold out against the EU on those two positions?
Well, I think those two issues are capable of resolution, and I think that the government should get on with negotiating instead of introducing legislation to breach the agreement that it's already signed. And the Prime Minister needs to answer a question, which is, when he signed that agreement, only actually a few months ago, did he know what he was doing, in which case why did he missell it to the nation, or did he not know, in which case we've gone to new levels of incompetence?
If these talks break down completely, as they may very well do in the next few days, would you support an extension?
Well, they don't need to break down, Andrew.
So give me an answer,
they don't need to break down. I want the government to get on with what it said it would do, deliver the deal, and concentrate on the pandemic across the country. People are talking about what are we doing about the pandemic and reopening.
Which would you prefer, extension or no deal?
I don't want no deal. But I think this can be resolved.
So extension is the answer.
These two issues, I do not accept that these two issues cannot be resolved. The government is reopening old wounds, and it should get on, negotiate, get a deal that's in the national interest, and then focus on the pandemic.
One other huge issue that's going to face all of British politics next year is Scotland.
Yeah.
Do you still agree that if Scotland votes for the SNP, who will have a new referendum in their manifesto for the Scottish elections, then that is a mandate that has to be respected?
I don't think that a further divisive referendum is right, and I think that it's in Scotland's interest and the United Kingdom's interest for us to stay together, and that's what we will be arguing from now into May. But I am frustrated that in the middle of a pandemic we've got the SNP talking about independence and we've got the Tories talking about Brexit, and I think most people would say, for heaven's sake, the issue that's uppermost in all of our minds now is the pandemic. Focus on that.
Let us turn to Scotland, because you said in January, and I'm going to read it back to you, they will have a mandate for that. I accept this is a question for Scotland. If Scotland votes SNP majority into Holyrood next year on a mandate for another referendum, would you try to block that?
Andrew, we will go into that election arguing that another divisive referendum is not in the interest of either Scotland or the United Kingdom, and make that argument.
This is about sovereignty and basic democratic values. Mark Drayford, who's your leader in Wales, said this recently. I'm very clear that if a population in Scotland or indeed in Wales wanted to hold a referendum, it is for the people of Wales and the people of Scotland to make that decision. Is he wrong?
Well, look, we're going to go into an election next May. I was in Scotland this week talking to Scottish Labour about our priorities and the arguments and strategy we would have going into May, and we will be making the argument that it's rebuilding the economy that matters, rebuilding public services and defeating the virus, not another divisive referendum.
So under if Scotland votes for the SNP and votes for a referendum, and the First Minister says, right, we're going to hold a referendum, we want a referendum, Labour will stand shoulder to shoulder with Boris Johnson and say, absolutely not. We at Westminster say you can't have it.
Andrew, I'm saying what our position is between now and May and the arguments that we will make. I'm not being hypothetical about what the future may hold.
But I've already read you your position after May, as it was in January, which is that you accept that there would be a mandate for a referendum.
Well, what I'm saying is, going into that election, we do not want another divisive referendum.
Let me return one final time to Brexit, because I'm still confused. You have always been somebody who believed in a flat market, a single European market, and we wanted to be part of that. The big issues are about fishing and about state aid. Now, I cannot understand why Labour would support a government which wants to change the rules on state aid. Surely you agree with the EU position that the level playing field on state aid is right for Britain going forward?
Well, I think the question on state aid that the government needs to answer is, why on earth are you not taking advantage of the rules as they now are? Because Germany spent far more on state aid, so's France. So I'm sceptical about this government's argument on state aid. If they're so keen on state aid, get on and use it to support British industries, but they've not done that in recent years.
OK, Sir Keir Starmer, thanks very, very much indeed for talking to us. Thanks to all my guests and to you for watching. For more political discussion, don't forget Politics Live with Joe Coburn is on BBC 2 through the week, starting tomorrow at 12:15. I will be back on BBC 1 at 9 a.m. next Sunday. Goodbye.
Get packing, everyone. We're heading to the tower as we relive some of the moments that rocked our world.
It's Blackpool!
It's the sparkliest show in town.